There's something peculiar about people who grew up under the golden sun of California during the 1970s. Something that goes far beyond childhood memories or faded photographs tucked away in dusty albums. It's a psychological imprint, an emotional fingerprint that shaped not just a generation, but the way that generation sees the world, relates to others, and constructs its own identity. This is a deep dive into the psychology of those who had 1970s California as the stage for their formation, a unique period in American history that left profound marks and wings of freedom at the same time. The 1970s was an era of deep contradictions. California was emerging from the turbulent ashes of the 60s, carrying with it the weight of unfulfilled promises from a cultural revolution while simultaneously planting the seeds of a new social order. For children born in the late 60s or early 70s, growing up in that state meant being immersed in a culture of experimentation, constant questioning, and an almost disconcerting freedom. It was a time when parents were rediscovering themselves, when traditional family structures were beginning to dissolve and reshape, and when the very notion of authority was being challenged on every corner. Psychologically, this created a specific type of adult. California children of the 70s grew up in an environment where exploration was encouraged, where conformity was viewed with suspicion, and where authenticity was valued above almost everything else. But this freedom had its price. Many of these children also grew up in homes where parents were so busy finding themselves that they forgot to provide the structure and security that every child needs. It was a generation raised with less supervision, more autonomy, and an early understanding that the world was complex, imperfect, and constantly changing. If you're enjoying this content, subscribe to the channel and leave in the comments the time you're watching this documentary. This helps us better understand our audience and continue bringing fascinating stories like this one. California in the 70s was a social laboratory. In cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and San Diego, countercultural movements still pulsed, though less intensely than in the previous decade. The state was a magnet for those seeking alternatives to the traditional American way of life. Communes flourished in rural areas. The human potential movement was in full swing at places like East Salem. Therapy was becoming mainstream. Divorce was normalizing. And children observed all of this, absorbing complex messages about relationships, commitment, individuality, and what it meant to be free. To understand the psychology of these people today, we need to understand that they were the first eyewitnesses to a massive social transformation. They saw their parents questioning everything, from organized religion to traditional gender roles. They saw women demanding equality and men trying to redefine masculinity. They saw the California economy transform, with Silicon Valley beginning to take shape and the entertainment industry expanding. This early exposure to constant change created adults who are naturally adaptable, but who may also struggle with long-term commitments or rigid structures. One of the most striking psychological traits of this generation is what we might call cautious optimism. They grew up in a place where everything seemed possible, where personal reinvention was not just accepted but celebrated. California has always sold the dream that you can be whoever you want to be, do whatever you want to do. For a child absorbing this message during formative years, it became part of their fundamental psychological structure. They believe in the possibility of change, in the human capacity for growth and transformation. But at the same time, they saw broken promises, crumbling dreams, and the harsh economic reality beginning to tighten at the end of the decade. So this optimism comes tempered with a healthy dose of skepticism. Another striking characteristic is the complex relationship with authority. California children of the 70s grew up at a time when challenging authority was almost a civic duty. They watched Watergate unfold on television. They saw teachers being questioned, police being challenged, and institutions being openly criticized. This created adults who don't automatically accept what they're told, who question, who investigate, who think critically. But it may also have created a difficulty in accepting necessary hierarchies or in trusting institutions that, despite being imperfect, serve important functions. Family life in 1970s California was often unconventional. Many of these children were raised in single-parent homes or blended families, something that was relatively new and stigmatized at the time. They became involuntary pioneers of new family arrangements. Psychologically, this meant learning early on to navigate complex relationships, to deal with losses and transitions, to build connections amid instability. Many developed early emotional independence, becoming self-sufficient because they had to be. This can manifest in adult life as admirable strength, but also as difficulty in asking for help or in forming healthy dependency bonds. There was also a unique exposure to cultural and ideological diversity. California in the 70s was a melting pot of cultures, philosophies, and lifestyles. A child could have friends from dozens of different backgrounds, be exposed to Buddhism, renewed Christianity, secular humanism, and everything in between, all before the age of 12. This exposure created adults with open minds and generally tolerant attitudes, capable of seeing multiple perspectives and comfortable with ambiguity. But it may also have created difficulty in finding firm anchors, in choosing a path when all paths seem equally valid or invalid. Media and popular culture played a huge role in psychological formation. Television was becoming ubiquitous, but it wasn't yet the dominant force it would become in subsequent decades. Children of the 70s played outside, explored their neighborhoods without constant supervision, invented games and stories. They had more physical freedom than any subsequent generation would have. This developed creativity, problem-solving skills, and an ability to entertain themselves. But when they watched TV, they saw programs that were beginning to reflect social changes, different families, social issues being addressed openly. The California economy in the 70s was in transformation. The state still offered abundant opportunities, but the seeds of inequality that would explode in later decades were already being planted. Children of this era grew up with an expectation that they could achieve material success, that upward mobility was possible and even probable. This created ambition, a willingness to work hard and pursue achievements. But it may also have generated internal pressure, a voice that says you should always be doing more, achieving more, being more. There's also an important generational component. These children were raised by parents from the silent generation or baby boomers, many of whom were actively rejecting the values they were raised with. This meant there was no clear manual. Parents were improvising, experimenting, sometimes brilliantly succeeding and sometimes failing terribly. Children had to develop their own moral compass, their own guidelines, their own values. This created adults who are independent thinkers, but who may also struggle with the feeling that they're always having to figure everything out on their own. California's physical environment also left its mark. Growing up with abundant sunshine, accessible beaches, mountains, and deserts created a connection with nature and an appreciation for the physical beauty of the world. Many of these people carry with them a need for open space, for light, for connection with the outdoors. They may feel suffocated in dense urban environments or in climates that don't offer the same kind of physical freedom. Psychologically, this manifests as a need for expansion, for possibility, for open horizons both literally and metaphorically. Education in 1970s California was going through its own revolutions. Alternative teaching methods were being experimented with. Progressive education had passionate advocates. Some children attended traditional schools while others experienced radically different educational environments. This created a generation with varied attitudes toward formal education, but generally with a valuing of lifelong learning and a willingness to question established methods. Let's talk about challenges and resilience. Growing up in a time of rapid change, in frequently unstable families, with less adult supervision, inevitably meant that many of these children faced challenging situations. They developed coping mechanisms, learned to adapt, to navigate complexities. This created remarkable resilience, an ability to recover from adversities. But it also meant that some experiences needed to be processed later in adult life. Many of this generation sought therapy, personal growth, and development as adults, trying to understand and integrate experiences they lived without the support that would have been ideal. Gender relations in 1970s California were undergoing significant transformation. Children absorbed messages about gender equality and the evolution of traditional roles. This created adults who generally have progressive views on gender and relationships, who value personal authenticity and who question arbitrary limitations. But it also means that many navigated their own adolescence and youth with less clear guidance, having to discover for themselves what worked for them in a scenario of constantly changing social norms. There's also an interesting spiritual dimension. California in the 70s was a spiritual melting pot, with people exploring everything from Eastern religions to Native American practices, from renewed Christianity to secular philosophical perspectives. Children were exposed to this spiritual diversity in ways that were rare in other parts of the country. This created adults who often have their own unique spiritual syntheses, taking elements from different traditions and creating something personal and eclectic. They tend to be less dogmatic but not necessarily less spiritual. The relationship with work is also distinct. These people grew up watching the birth of startup culture in Silicon Valley, watching the entertainment industry expand, watching new forms of work emerging. They absorbed the idea that work could be more than just a paycheck, that it could be creative expression, that it could change the world. But they also saw precariousness, saw unrealized dreams and the harsh reality that not everyone can turn passion into profession. This created an ambivalence about work, a desire for meaning but also a pragmatic recognition of material needs. One of the most psychologically fascinating characteristics is what we might call comfort with contradiction. These people grew up in an environment so full of contradictory messages, so full of paradoxes, that they learned to hold multiple truths simultaneously. They can value both individual freedom and community responsibility. They can be skeptical about institutions but recognize their necessity. They can embrace change but long for stability. This ability to live with contradiction is both a strength and a source of internal tension. As these people age, many are reflecting on what it meant to have been part of this unique social experiment. They're looking at their own children and grandchildren, comparing childhoods, noting dramatic differences. There's often nostalgia for the freedom they had, for the sense of unlimited possibility, for the cultural optimism that existed even amid challenges. But there's also a recognition of the complexities lived, of the lessons that came from difficult experiences, and of the structures that might have been missing at times. The mental health of this generation reflects their unique experiences. Many are deeply introspective, accustomed to examining their own internal processes. They value personal growth and are open to seeking support when needed. Like any generation, some face emotional challenges, which may be related to the particular characteristics of their era, whether navigating uncertainties or processing complex expectations. They're generally open about mental health in ways that previous generations were not, contributing to the destigmatization of these topics. Aging brings its own series of psychological reflections. These people are now in middle age or approaching old age, looking back on lives that were shaped by those formative years in California. They're evaluating what they've achieved, what they've left behind, who they've become. Many feel they were pioneers, opening paths for subsequent generations. Others feel they got stuck between worlds, not completely part of their parents' generation nor fully aligned with younger generations. Californian identity itself is an important psychological component. Even those who left the state carry with them something of its essence. There's a certain attitude, an openness, a fundamental optimism tempered with pragmatism. There's a valuing of innovation, of creativity, of authenticity. And there's a persistent sense that change is not just possible but inevitable, an acceptance of impermanence that can be both liberating and unsettling. When we look at the totality of the psychological experience of those who grew up in 1970s California, we see a complex tapestry of forces, influences, and experiences that created a particular type of person. They are resilient and reflective individuals, optimistic yet realistic, independent yet longing for connection, embracing change yet seeking meaning. They are products of a unique time and place, carrying within them the marks of that extraordinary era. And perhaps the deepest lesson is that we are all, to a certain extent, products of our time and place. The experiences of our childhood, the cultural context in which we grew up, the messages we absorbed, all of this becomes part of who we are. For those who had the fortune or misfortune of growing up in California during that turbulent and transformative decade, the marks are particularly distinct. They became navigators of change, questioners of authority, seekers of authenticity, bearers of contradictions. In the end, what remains is gratitude. Gratitude for the experiences that shaped these lives, for the freedoms enjoyed, for the lessons learned, both the easy and the difficult ones. And perhaps, above all, gratitude for the ongoing journey of understanding, of growth, of becoming more fully human. May the Lord God bless each person who carries these memories, who walked these paths, and who continues to write their story with the wisdom gained through experience.